Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Double Down, the live online news and affairs programme that puts people first. It's Thursday the 3rd of June 21. We're broadcasting live from Dundalk, Dublin and Longford, and we are your hosts Finbar Markey and Anna Kavanagh. Welcome to the show, everyone. I know that we have viewers all over the planet, and we hope that you're having the weather over the last week that we've been having here in Ireland. Glorious early summer sunshine. Get that vitamin D into you. What a busy lineup we have for you tonight. We are joined by business analyst Donal Jackson and lecturer in social studies Kevin Howard to discuss, if not to debate, the subject of the free market and state interventionism to address socio-economic inequality. And I'm really looking forward to that debate. Before that, Anna Kavanagh is joined by small farmers representative Brendan Kelly, and Anna will also share her news and views with us towards the end of the show. But before any of that, here's the news that they definitely won't see on TV. In Irish news first, and Fine Gael TD Jennifer Carroll McNeill has been in hot water this week for making a presentation at an online conference hosted by a dissident Iranian group, the People's Mujahideen of Iran. It's being reported that the group has been described by its own ex-members as a cult, and it itself claims to be dedicated to overthrowing the Islamic Republic. The group has been accused of carrying out torture, and the UN has described them as terrorists, saying, and I quote, "It is involved in terrorist activities and is therefore a less legitimate replacement for the current regime in Iran." Fine Gael TD Jennifer McNeill has since apologised for her presentation at the conference hosted by that group. An organisation called Medicines for Ireland has published a report this week highlighting that many millions of euros has been lost to the HSE through the non-use of generic medicines. The report, titled Generic Medicines in Ireland, highlights that since 2013, the HSE has saved over 1.3 billion euros by using generic medicines, but that it is still well below the EU average. The HSE currently spends on average 2.4 billion per year on medicines, the biggest portion of its annual budget and the highest in the EU per capita. A new ESRI report has argued that the state should increase their direct spending on housing from the current 2 billion euros to between 6 and 9 billion euros per annum, ending the reliance on foreign private investment to meet the dire housing needs of the state. The ESRI, recently a conservative in direction, is a central pillar economic think tank, and the recent report by Professor Kieran McQuinn is a rejection of current government policy. The political correspondent of the Irish Independent, Hugh O'Connell, described the report as an endorsement of Sinn Féin's housing policy. Last night, Donal, the Irish Parliament, voted to extend the COVID emergency powers of the Minister for Health and of An Garda Síochána, which is the Irish police force. The votes were 73 for and 68 against the extension. There was little debate on the extension bill, with most of the opposition voting against the extension. And finally, in Irish news, the Department of Foreign Affairs has said that Ireland will be working more closely with NATO and the developing EU army in the coming years. In a statement to the Commission on Defence, the department has said that they intend on taking on more international responsibilities and that this will involve equipping Ireland's army with enhanced capabilities to meet those responsibilities. This is being done through one of the many EU quangos functioned with building an EU military industrial complex. And this quango is ironically named the Partnership for Peace. Claire Daly spoke on the issue in the EU Parliament this week, and we have footage of that now.
Thanks, President, and thanks to the speakers. I mean, I'm obviously completely opposed to the whole fund. I think it's a ridiculous waste of money when the money could be spent on things like health or climate change that actually might make the world a safer place. But just on the study itself, I note the big emphasis on the need to reel in member states that don't have a history of arms production into taking part in these programmes. We're told this is crucial to proactively reach out to newcomers in the realms of weapons development. So I'm wondering, I know you touched on it, but how do you see this working out in the example of countries like Ireland, which have no tradition really in this regard? Has there been much dialogue there? How would you see that working out in practice to broaden that base, as it were? And secondly, then, you talk a lot in the study about the Commission's capacity to steer change in the common European interest in the field of defence. I'm wondering, what you think that common European interest is, because as far as I can see, there's very little commonality between, say, what the threats would be perceived to be in Ireland, for example, as Poland. And isn't this one of the reasons why you have such a problem in the strategic compass, that those differences exist? So I'm wondering what you think these so-called common threats and common interests are. Thanks, President.
And in UK news, a mass march in London against COVID passports attracted hundreds of thousands of people who attended last Saturday. Despite a news blackout on the march, the UK government have since announced that they're scrapping vaccine passports. The Tory government had planned to make vaccine status passports mandatory for use at concert halls and other indoor events. But the pushback from the public has been too great, despite a strong Tory majority in Parliament and apparent cross-party support for the idea. It has been revealed that 1/3 of the British cabinet have been funded by Israel. While the UK has been backing Israel's intense bombing campaign in Gaza, the data drilling and journalism organisation Declassified has revealed that 1/3 of the cabinet ministers in the UK, and the foreign minister in particular, who are responsible for the Middle East, have been bankrolled in one form or another by the Israeli government or pro-Israeli lobby groups. Many UK ministers have had trips and holidays to Israel paid for by the Israeli state or lobby groups on behalf of Israel, with one such lobby group actually paying for Boris Johnson's election campaign bus. And finally, in international news, the scandal at the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons rages on this week as more reputed journalists begin to report on a doctored OPCW investigation into chemical weapons attacks in Dumas in Syria. The alleged chemical attack on his own people by Bashir Assad, the elected president of Syria, were proven false and were staged according to the original OPCW investigation. The original investigation report was, however, significantly doctored by senior officials at the organisation. The report was then used as a pretext for military attacks in Syria. The original investigators, as well as the co-founder, have been calling for a full investigation and a reinstigation of the original report. It was originally reported by Vanessa Beeley and Eva Bartlett, young journalists from the UK and Canada. With the doctored report being used once more to intervene in Syria, this story is far from over. That's the news that you won't see on TV this week, folks. Before we go any further, before we get into our main show, we're asking you, as we do every week, to like and share the show, to tag some friends in it, to write into the comment box some friends' names and get them watching as well. It's the only way that we're going to spread independent media. We're joined now by Anna Kavanagh and Brendan Kelly, who are going to discuss some farming issues first. So we'll pass you straight over to Anna now.
Brendan Kelly is the former chairperson of the Independent Farmers of Ireland, and this farm group were to the fore in the protests outside the factory gates in August-September 2019. Brendan is now going to chat to me about a new initiative that the farmers are undertaking. Brendan, you're very welcome to Double Down. Brendan, I think, has to unmute his mic. Brendan, if you can just unmute your mic there. Yes. Okay, Finbar, I just to pick up there on that serious story, it's very, very interesting.
Yes, and when that was originally reported back over 5 years ago by Eva Bartlett and Vanessa Beeley, they were treated terribly. So one of the guys are from Canada and one's from the UK. They were treated absolutely terribly by the international press and by the political establishment. But some more mainstream journalists have now caught on to the story, including that young guy, Aaron Maté, that we featured last week. And so it's starting to get some traction now. And it's about time, because the OPCW is a very important organisation, and it appears that it's been taken over by interest groups that do not want it to do its job.
Hello, Anna, how are you?
I think we'll begin again. Brendan Kelly is the former chairperson of the Independent Farmers of Ireland, and this farm organisation were to the fore in the factory gate disputes that took place in August-September 2019. But this evening, Brendan is going to speak to me about a new initiative that's been undertaken by the FOI. Brendan, you're very welcome to Double Down.
Thanks, Anna.
This phone here is ringing. Sorry about that interruption.
Can you hear me?
Brendan, this has to do with the Aarhus Convention. Can you tell me, please, in just very, very simple terms, what is the Aarhus Convention?
Well, the Aarhus Convention was signed into Irish law on the 12th of June, the 20th of June 2012, and it gives special powers to the communities and the local people to make decisions that affected them and their environment. The three major issues of the Aarhus Convention was, first, equal access to justice. Second was freedom of information. And third was the public participation in the decision-making process. And the third one is the one I want to talk about most. It actually gave the community groups and the area groups and the little small groups, they had to be allowed into the decision-making process once the discussion was about issues that concerned them.
Yes, continue. I can understand all of that.
Now, it was all to do with sustainability. The whole thing is all about sustainability. And for sustainability to exist, there has to be standards for sustainability. And the people that should agree the standards of sustainability has to be made up of people from the different sections. And there's three sections: social, environmental, and economic.
Right.
Now, we know the economic and the environmental, we know all about. They've been there. And as we can see with the decisions that's been making, we'll use, for example, the turf cutters. The decision made with the turf cutters were all environmentally based, whereas the actual people that own the bogs, they weren't at the meetings when these decisions were made. They weren't even consulted. And it was totally wrong. It affects all the decisions that is being made, whether it's our oil, our gas, our fishing rights, our farming, our turf, our forestries. All those decisions should be made with equal representation on the boards of the social, environmental, and economic pillars.
Okay, so as you say, there are three pillars, and your
Yes.
contention, Brendan, is that we have two of the pillars in place. The environmental and the economic pillars are in place, but the social pillar is not in place. So tell me about this representation that you're making to Brussels.
Well, we're making now what we have done. We found this, where this came to light was that during the dispute with the farmers, the task force was set up, and the independent farmers of Ireland, they followed proper procedure. They held a meeting and they elected Seamus May to represent them on the task force, them and other farmers. There was other small farming groups as well. There was over 600 people at a meeting, and they elected the person that they wanted to represent them. So when the task force came up, Seamus May wasn't allowed in, which was totally illegal under the terms of the Aarhus Convention. So I started looking at it, but a few more. Now, I'm not at this alone. There's a lot of people involved, actually. But we found that in all the decisions, the social pillar was never represented. So what we've done since is that we've joined up, I think there's about 30 groups now, 30 little small community groups. We've joined them all up, and we have done exactly what the environmental pillar done. We have formed the Irish Social Network. Now, the Irish Environmental Network is the environmental group. So we have all these set up, and what we're going to do now is that we're preparing a complaint to Europe that Ireland are in breach of the Aarhus Convention.
And Brendan, how advanced are you in the formulation of that complaint?
It'll be done the next week. It'll be done the next week. And we're actually making a small complaint well, it's not a small complaint. We're actually making a complaint to another group. COPA is the name of them, and we'll be making that this weekend. And COPA is a group in Europe. We haven't the full details of them yet, but they are a group that watch other countries, all the other countries in Europe, to see how advanced they are in sustainability and the sustainable standards for our food production.
Okay, so just to finish up then, Brendan, what do you hope will be the outcome of all of this? What would you like to see happen?
Well, the government have no choice now other than allow the people we represent. We'll say if the discussion tomorrow morning by these people, that we'll say if they're discussing the fishery issue that's a live topic at the moment, that a representative of the fishermen has to be at that table, and the meeting cannot go ahead while the fishermen are not represented at the table. So what we want to do, we want to get our people, the proper people, sitting at the table to discuss the issues that concerns them, which they're entitled to under the Aarhus Agreement. And second, we want to look back over all the decisions that have been made up to now, where the social community was not, or the social pillar was not represented properly. And we look at them very closely, and if they're illegal, those decisions are going to have to be reversed.
So you say, Brendan, just to finish up, that you have about 30 groups that have come together to form the social pillar. And can any other groups join you if they so wish?
And we welcome every group. Now, the environmental pillar are of environmental groups, the people that are concerned with the environment. Now, the social groups are people that are concerned about the person. So any group that has concerns about people are more than welcome, and we have to allow them in. We don't have a choice. They are entitled to be on the social pillar. Whether it's turf cutters are about people, homelessness, the homeless groups have to be included. Every one of those small groups that we hardly ever hear from, all those groups has to be represented on the social pillar from here on in.
Okay, well, that's very, very interesting, Brendan, and we'll watch that space. So basically, in effect, the Aarhus Convention, which has been ratified by Ireland, is supposed to have three pillars: the economic, the environmental and the social pillar. And it's the contention of Brendan there that the social pillar has never actually been properly established. So thank you for watching, and please share.
Thanks very much, Anna, for having me on.
Thank you, Brendan Kelly, for coming on the show. I remember a number of years ago speaking to people who were involved in a campaign to have another pillar of our house, which is the right to legal representation enshrined. and activated in Ireland, and I hope that has been achieved. I haven't heard of it in a few years. I am often perplexed by discussions that are couched in left-right polarizations or models, as it were. I'm frustrated because left-right seems to have changed in meaning over the last while. When I was younger, left-right was mainly an economic thing, and it was about socio-economics and whether the state should involve itself in trying to address and tackle socio-economic inequality in Ireland, or whether it should be left to free market forces to address issues like that. I'm delighted to be able to facilitate a discussion on that subject for the next 30 minutes or so. I'm joined by business analyst Donal Jackson and by lecturer in social policy Kevin Howard. And we're going to put three. Hi Kevin, hi Donal, how are you?
Good, thanks.
Hi folks.
Good. Hi Kevin.
Hi Donal.
Thanks for joining us tonight.
You're very welcome. Glad to be here.
Good. I'm going to put three basic enough but very broad, I suppose, and deep questions in a way, but basic in structure to our guests. And I'm going to ask them to respond to the question in as much detail as they want, but they're also going to have an opportunity as the questions progress to respond to each other's responses as well, if you know what I mean. So to add a little bit of meat to the debate rather than having one of these very brief discussions, if ever these discussions happen on mainstream media. So the first question, if you just let me get it opened up here. And again, the issue is the free market versus government intervention. Should states develop strategies to address socio-economic inequality? Should states develop strategies to address socio-economic inequality? And I suppose the add-on to that is, or should it be left to the free market? I'll put that to Donal first, if you don't mind, Kevin.
Fine.
Thanks, and good evening, everyone. The difficulties that arise when the state intervenes in anything are what people are left to deal with then. You can pick any subject in society and look where the state intervenes, and it seems that they forget what consequences are. For example, and the big one that's operating today and everyone is talking about, the housing situation in Ireland. Now, everyone thinking from a state point of view, in other words, what I would call a socialist agenda, are looking to have what they call affordable housing. Now, without doubt, and you give me a little bit of time here, the market provides everything that can be afforded in the market. What people are looking for is the unaffordable housing, and have someone pay the difference, with them not being the someone. Now, how a state can address that? The state comes out to borrow money to provide housing, and that money goes into society, but it goes into a particular group in society who have it first and can use that money. If price rises then, the expansion of that money system is called inflation. People get this mixed up, thinking inflation is price rising. It's not. It's expansion of the money supply. In other words, you're inflating the balloon. The result of that, what manifests itself, is everything else costs more money. And that's what happens when the state intervenes. Now, if I have money in my pocket and it costs me more to buy something, I'm thinking about whether I'm buying it or not. And if I'm buying it in a particular shop and I stop, this is just a small example. And you can multiply me by as many thousands as you like. The money that should have been going into that shop is now not going in. The shopkeeper is looking at the number of employees he has or she has and saying, well, I can't afford, John or Joan or whoever. I can't afford to keep you on. And this is the consequence of state intervention. Now, you can apply that across the board in any way we like. Now, you talk about equality, and let me be very clear here. There's no such thing as equality. And this causes all the problems. There's equality of opportunity, yes. Should the state ensure that that's the way we are in our country, in our society, in our community? Without doubt. People must have equal access to opportunities.
Okay. Can I just pass it over to Kevin? If you want to respond to what Donal has said before you maybe answer the question of your own bat, as it were. Do you have anything that you'd like to comment in relation to what Donal has said?
I'm not really sure, because if we just take Ireland as an example, in the last 20 years, it seems to me that the period when free markets, well, there are no such thing as free markets, but when the market was given the freest rein we've seen in a long time, was between, say, 1993 and 2008. And it seemed to me that that was the premise of the Celtic Tiger, was don't interfere, let the market, let business people supply the needs that clearly were there, and it ended up in absolute chaos. I mean, it didn't seem to me that there was any socially beneficial outcome from the housing boom and bust. Us, as we all know, are part of the cycle of business, and the less regulation and the less modification of these booms and busts, the more extreme they seem to be. But so the housing issue is really complex. And there's one thing that people are missing in the housing thing. We now have 1 million more people than we had in the beginning of the 90s. We have a growing population all the time. We also have a greater demand for houses in that households are smaller. Okay, there are people forming households with two people. There are people forming households on their own. It isn't the case where a person would get married and they would have a large number of children. That would be one household. The diversity of households has increased, so therefore the demand for housing types has increased, and the actual growth in population has increased. So there are huge pressures on the housing market and if we look back to when we did allow the market to meet the needs of housing demand, it led to chaos. So I'm not really sure about the free market solution pretty much to anything. I mean, if I look back in Irish history, there were free market solutions to the famine as well. I mean, the whole point: stop interfering, don't let the government interfere. You'll only create a dependency culture. These people are feckless. These people will only come to rely on handouts. These people need to work to earn food. What did we see there? There was government intervention that was stopped, and it was stopped on the basis of the principle that the markets could provide, or the market should provide. And if people couldn't afford the food, then too bad for the people. Now, we've had these examples in Ireland of free markets being let rip, and they are socially catastrophic, absolutely catastrophic. One of the great books written about the markets, Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation, talked about the emergence of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, were underpinned by much of the same thinking, incidentally, that informed the famine, the British approach to the famine in the 1940s. But Polanyi is talking about the decision by the British government that laissez-faire be, to let it be, laissez-faire, let rip. And the social consequences were so devastating that the state had to step in and regulate the market. Now, I'm not a person who is in favor of state control of everything. I don't believe in a command and control economy, but I do believe that a free market solutions have not proven very effective when they've been left unfettered. The market needs to be regulated like all human activities. And it's a question then of how do we regulate the market to produce the optimal outcomes. So the free market, to me, has never really, when it is a laissez-faire market, when it is let rip, it's never really shown to have produced beneficial outcomes in anything other than the short term for a few people. Over any extended length of time, it results in chaos, and it requires a state to step in and regulate the excesses of the market. Now, the regulation of the market, that's what we're talking about. That's the issue. Now, just to clarify something you said earlier, I'm not a social policy expert. I don't study social policy. My background is political philosophy. But the regulation, we're talking about variations on a theme here, rather than the two extreme points of view. I think about a command and control economy, which we saw in many places didn't particularly work particularly well either, and a laissez-faire economy doesn't particularly work well either. It's trying to find some kind of mechanism that regulates markets to produce the best optimal outcome. Now, one thing I would do, and we talked about the state provision, one thing I would do, and I don't know what anyone thinks about this, anybody who takes their wages from the public purse should be forced, or not be forced, but should be required to avail of public services. And what I mean by that is any politician who's paid by the public purse should travel on public transport, should send their children to public schools, should get their healthcare in the public system, and live in so-called affordable or public housing. I do believe in the principle of skin in the game, and I think that if the public servants, I'm a public servant, I do believe if the public servants were compelled or required to avail of the public services that we provide, the quality of those services would change.
Okay, we seem to have some feedback there. Stephen, producer Stephen, could you help us with that? I don't know who it's coming from. Is it coming from Donal Jackson, maybe? Oh, okay, it was Kevin. So we just have Kevin muted until we come back to him in a wee minute. Donal, there would be, would I be right in saying that you would be for having no public services, having everything really privatized, no public transport, for instance, no public health system, stuff like that? You would encourage, as much as possible, maybe not completely, but as much as possible, no public services, that everything should be privatized. You're there, Donal?
You there? Okay.
Yeah, you don't. So,
I hear the question from Mark. The answer is, of course, there has to be public service involvement. And of course, we have to pay a tax for that. But this is for example, if I'm a wealthy individual and I can afford my own, for the want of a better term, Garda Síochána to be around my house, to be around my car when I drive it wherever. People who live close to my house gain the benefit of that as well. For that reason, everyone should contribute to having a Garda Síochána. The same with our military, the same with our fire services, the same to a great degree, but very specific within our health services.
Let's get into that a bit, because I don't know whether you're just trying to sound a little bit empathetic towards the general public, irrespective of the situation, or whether I'm just trying to establish your boundaries here. So when you say specific health issues, what do you mean by that?
Okay, you just bear with me now.
Yeah.
The difference between need and want and demand. Think about those three words. Now, we have people who really need, but why do they really need? They have to be looked after. We are, society, we're community, we're human. But let's look at those who just want because they feel they're entitled. When they pressurize cowardly politicians to give them what they want, there's a cost to that. And the people who pay that cost are the people who need. The wealthy people are not paying it.
And tell me,
there's an imbalance here.
What about the people who want to collectively come together through a taxation system to provide services?
I have no problem.
Health services, for instance.
Listen to this. Have you ever heard of the forgotten man?
No, tell me.
Okay, I'll tell you who he is. 3 people two of them politicians talking about how they solve a problem for another man, but taking another man's money to do so. The man's money that they take is the forgotten man, and he's being drained all the time in this country. And what happens? He emigrates, or his children do. And what happens? We have a brain drain. There's a million things happening in Ireland. And I just want to point out two things to you this way, Finbar. And Kevin, is the market is not a physical entity. The market are the decisions that we make as people every minute of every day, and how we respond to the decisions made by other people every minute of every day, be them in business or social. The market is not something waiting with a sword or a physical entity that anyone can point at. This is used by socialists the Grim Reaper is coming, the market. The market are just people reacting in the way they want to. And
okay. Can I pass over to Kevin for a minute? Kevin,
it's important I finish this.
Oh yeah, go on ahead. Sorry, go on ahead.
Socialists want to harness everyone to their way of thinking. And we've seen examples of this in different parts of the world. The biggest and best country in the world has been destroyed over the last 70 years by socialism, and that's the USSR, Russia.
Okay. All right. Can I just move over to Kevin for a wee minute? Kevin is not representing a socialist position here, but more discussing socio-economic equality and things like that. Kevin, there's a lot of takers and a lot of wanters out there, and free market is ultimately pure democracy. Do you want to respond to that?
Well, I don't know where to go. I mean, I don't think that anyone is saying that the free market is anything other than human beings making decisions. I mean, obviously, that's society is a collection of individuals and human beings in networks and communities and all the rest of it. It's just that if we look, I mean, I don't understand about what the Soviet Union destroyed over the last 70 years. I mean, compared to what? The serfdom under the Tsar. I mean, really. I mean, life expect. I don't understand that comparison. I'm not advocating for the Soviet Union. Don't get me wrong here. And I think Stalin was a totalitarian nightmare. But compared to the Tsar was hardly the Tsarist Russia was hardly a paradise. So totalitarian control, whether it's of the left or the right, is not really optimal for anybody. We're on that. But all I'm talking about is here in Ireland, when we've had laissez-faire economics in Ireland, the consequences have been devastating. Our own famine shows it. I mean, we lost 1 million people left to starve to death because the argument was, well, the markets will fix this. The markets will provide the solution. You cannot interfere with the market because you will create, and I've heard it in the tone of what you were saying there, you'll create a dependency culture. You'll create people who want something. That was exactly the argument that was used. You'll create these effectless, and all they'll want is something for nothing from someone else. Someone else will have to pay for it. Therefore, don't interfere. Let the market decide. What was the consequence? Social devastation. It changed this country irrevocably. And you talk about immigration. It was the famine that created immigration. We have a tradition of immigration in this country that when things get bad, people start moving. They're not immigrating now in anything like the numbers that they were. They're coming home now. There are people coming here and there are people coming from other countries because this country is a relatively good place to live. It isn't anything like as dark as people suggest. It is a good place to live. It has a lot of problems because of growing population and because of restricted housing and all the rest of it. But it is a positive growing place. I'm very glad to be here. And I think that the solution to social problems that are on an unfettered laissez-faire market, we've seen the examples. It's devastating. There are plenty of countries around the world with failed states. I don't see too many people immigrating to those countries. The state is a necessity. The state is absolutely essential. And the debate is about to what extent does the state regulate the market. That's the debate. Not about whether the state should regulate the market. Of course it should. But the debate is to what extent should it regulate the market.
Okay. Donal, do you have any response to that?
specifically to the question I can put for the sake of people listening in and wanting my position with regard to the state, I would say, am I on mute again? Sorry, can you hear me? Okay. Take a score of 20. The state should have 1 out of 20. The rest, we can take care of ourselves. Think about this. We have, I don't know how many, is it 16 sitting around the cabinet table? How many decisions are made in Ireland on an hourly basis? And a great example is what we've gone through with the pandemic. 20 years ago, I asked Bertie Ahern, he was Taoiseach then, to put a panel together to look at what could happen in this country and how we could deal with a pandemic. He laughed at me. You just can't get away from the hubris of people like that. We're seeing it here again. Oh, we let you out now, but you can't eat in that restaurant, but you can eat on the side of the road.
But isn't that a very different issue from discussing social equality?
No, Finbar. It's the same mentality, and that's what I want to get at, and that's where the crux of it comes. It's like you know we're in. I know Kevin was saying that the market destroyed everything. We never had a time in Ireland when we had laissez-faire market, free market. Never. We had interference.
You did in the 1840s. You had free markets. You had one in London that took over, were completely laissez-faire.
Hold on, Kevin. Hold on.
We had the English dominating us. We were under the oppression of the Catholic Church. We never had free market.
Well, can we pull back to the noughties when there was significant reduction?
Let me talk for a moment on what happened. We'll say from, as Kevin pointed out.
Well, I prefer to talk about more modern things, if you don't mind. I don't want to get lost in talking about 150 years ago in the noughties.
From 1995 to 2008. Let me talk about that for a minute.
Yes.
I watched government, the daily thing. Everyone in the opposition were shouting at the government, "You're not giving enough. You're not giving enough. We want you to give more." To make welfare a state of living, a standard of living. Think about that. The left wing in Ireland want to make welfare a standard of living. Who's going to work? Who's going to provide food? Who's going to make all the things that need to be made?
Respectfully, Donal, in that period, we had the highest employment in the history of the state, and we were taking people in from all over the world because we had such high employment.
In the construction industry.
Yeah, but to suggest that in the noughties we became a greater social welfare state,
or the periphery of same. I went through it. You know, you can't tell me that what I seen. And then at the end of it, we saw the government jumping ship because their pensions might be interfered with. We saw criminal bankers walking away laughing at the questions a makeshift ignorant tribunal was trying to ask them about the time and the money. Shortly after that, we had the editor of a big newspaper drip feeding us recordings of a bank for the sake of getting more people buying the paper so they could charge more advertising. This is the control command economy that you're saying that we need. Now, I said at the start.
No, that's not true. In fact, I believe that Kevin said we don't need that.
People who are in need. We need to look after people who are in need. But here's the question. Who's in need and who decides they're in need?
Okay. Well, Finbar, yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. I've never advocated for a control economy. That is not what I'm advocating for. I think there are very, very successful democracies in Europe that don't have command and control economies. They rely on the market. They rely on private enterprise and capitalism, but they regulate it, and they regard their societies as communities. and they have a very Republican sense of community, which I think that we're kind of lacking in Ireland. We don't seem to have a Republican sense of community in Ireland where we're all in this boat together, and that we are our brother's keepers, and that we do need to redistribute resources to lessen the gap between the really extremely wealthy and those who are less fortunate in society. This is a society, not an economy. The economy should be, as the old cliche goes, in the service of, not society at the service of the economy, because there and all this notion about the self-made men, the myth of the self-made man. There are plenty of men who made stuff plenty for themselves, but there are no self-made people. There are no self-made men. That's all a myth. Everybody relies on everybody else. I mean, I know that we all rely on schools, we all rely on universities, we all rely on public services. There are, if you're gonna go down the free market route, how far would you go, Donal? I mean, would you privatize schools? Would you privatize hospitals? I mean, how far would you go with this privatization, with the free market? That's what I'm interested in finding out. Would you privatize education, for example?
Donal, yes. Do you want to come in on that?
Yes.
You would?
Yes. Why not?
You'd privatize education.
You need to understand. Look, when I say privatize, right, that's an awful word people run away from nowadays. I'm not saying that people who need help shouldn't be helped. And
no, we're not asking that. Just would you privatize education? Yeah.
Yes.
For all of it.
Just it has to be the priority to ensure a fair return on investment. And let me ask you this question. Where do you think the money the government spend, where do you think they get it?
They get it from taxation in its broadest sense.
They get it from the private sector.
They get it from taxation in its broadest sense, yeah. And they borrow it.
There's no money, yes, and the private sector repay it. And depending on how strong the private sector is, the buyers of the bonds decide on the interest rate they charge. But the private sector repay it all. And this is, I'm not saying that this has to stop dead.
Are you meaning through corporation tax on?
I'm saying, look, if we had sense, if it was...
I'm just trying to establish, do you mean that the private sector are paying for the education system through corporation tax? I'm just trying to establish that.
No, taxation is much broader than that.
You can't put a finger, Finbar, Kevin, you can't put a finger on the amount of tax a person pays every week and where it's going. It's going into a general fund, and these guys can dip at it as they please. And let me tell you who's first in line to dip at it. The minister.
That's just not true. I mean, what would you do? What would you put in? Sorry.
Just let Kevin come in for a minute. Don't let Kevin come in.
This is a circular.
Don't listen. I'm facilitating this debate. Just let Kevin come in for a wee minute, please. Thank you.
I noticed that you stood for election a number of times yourself, Donal, and I think that personally you're a hero for doing so. Because I think people who stand for election are moral heroes. I think they're heroes of our society. I really do. To put yourself out there like that is a courageous thing. So fair play to anyone who does it. But my question to you then is, you're very scathing about politicians. What would you have in their place? Business people?
No, there wouldn't be anyone in their place.
So you're an anarchist?
Just a minute now. We just wouldn't have them. And if you want government size, you can revert back a few years, maybe a good few. And a group that had this down to a T and understood this and still understand it today is the Catholic Church. They understand the value of family. They understand the strength of family. Now, there were a few rogue people within it. We won't go there. There's criminals everywhere. But the biggest, entity as a government that we should see should be in the county council. And the mayor of the county should be responsible for how the county is run. At the moment, people paying tax in Leitrim are building lovely footpaths and walkways and lovely scenery for tourists in Killarney.
Well, I'll agree with you on one thing. I mean, I'll agree with one thing. Any boundary is arbitrary, whether it's the island of Ireland, whether it's Cork, whether it's Leitrim, whatever. But I do agree with you that local politicians should be making decisions, or local elected representatives should be making decisions on local services. And I do agree with local taxation. I do agree with subsidiarity. If that's what you Catholic Church, the principle of subsidiarity, I agree with that. I think there should be more power devolved to local decisions and service providers.
Okay, guys, I think I saw a little dove of peace just fly behind both of you.
No, well, I think that's a fair. That's
point, Finbar, just to be
yes,
for another night that I can come on and talk about it. There is a way around this housing conundrum. There is a way, and I can talk at length about that.
Oh, please don't, not right now, because we're limited on time. But a sentence or two.
What?
We're limited on time, so a sentence or two.
Okay, I give you. Housing can be, the whole housing conundrum can be sorted through generational mortgages. I can leave my house to my son who continue the payment. Right now, the interest rate, but we need, at the moment in Ireland, the banks are afraid of their life to lend to anyone. You have companies opening up saying, oh, we'll have 1,000 jobs here and 1,000 jobs there, but they're not jobs that you build a career on. Bankers are not stupid. They got burned 10, 15 years ago. They haven't forgotten. They're not. This is why these big funds are coming in, and they're lending to the developers on the condition that the developers sell them so they can rent. They get a return on that investment for a few years while we're waiting for enough to be built privately.
Okay, right. Listen, what we're going to do, folks.
It's not.
No, Finbar. That this is Finbar.
Okay,
there is. Do you have a minute? Because
yeah, go on.
What this idea of intergenerational mortgages? Okay, this is interesting, and personally, I'd like to hear a bit more about it. Where would the money come from? Who would guarantee the loans? Who would the person be borrowing the money from? Who would guarantee them, and who owns the property at the end of it?
Those questions will not be answered today, but you've lined us up for another program.
I can answer all those questions.
No, but please not now, because we're so over time.
It sounds to me like affordable housing.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point, Kevin. Okay, let's not go any further, except I'm going to give both of you 2 more sentences each on whether the state has a place in intervening to address social inequality. Donal, I'll give you 2 sentences, 3 at the most on that.
Okay.
To close off.
I think, and this will, drive everyone mad, and they'll throw shoes at the computers or television. Where there is no profit to be made for the private sector, the state can intervene.
And that's your closing remark, yeah?
That's it.
That's okay. Kevin?
Yeah, of course, the state has to intervene. The state does intervene. It's how it does it, and how it does. How should the state intervene optimally? And going back to Donald's statement, there's no such thing as equality. Of course, there is. There's equality before the law. There's equality of moral worth for every single person. That's just a given. So everybody is of equal moral worth, and everybody should be treated that way.
Okay, guys. We will have, hopefully, if you're willing, we'll have you back on to get into some other conversations on issues like this into the future. But for tonight, I'm really happy about the way the conversation went. I hope it opened up the eyes of the public and helped them make some decisions about who they are politically.
Thanks,
Kevin Howard, Donal Jackson, thanks for joining us. And
thanks,
we'll be speaking to you again soon.
Thanks, Donal. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, folks, we're over time as usual, but no harm. It was a good discussion and a good debate. We're going to pass over to our wonderful Anna Kavanagh for her news and views of the week.
Good evening and welcome to this week's news and views, where I try to join the dots to see the bigger picture of what is actually happening in our country. And tonight I'm going to examine the accelerating erosion of democracy in Ireland. And to begin, the OPW is 6.7 million over budget on the new 86.6 million Garda headquarters that is not fit for purpose, and they have overpaid Larry Goodman 10 million in rent because they didn't measure the Department of Health offices properly. The Dáil's spending watchdog, the Public Accounts Committee, reported last week that the new €86.6 million headquarters for An Garda Síochána is no longer fit for purpose, as it won't be big enough to fit all personnel from the Garda units that were due to move there. The complex on Military Road in Kilmainham, estimated to cost 6.6 million over budget, is the current Garda accommodation at Harcourt Square, which has been leased from a commercial landlord. The Public Account Committee report also says there's ongoing issues with the lease of Messiah Plaza, owned by Larry Goodman, that's used as the headquarters of the Department of Health and also accommodates other state agencies. The OPW's mismeasurement of the floor space for the building is expected to result in an overpayment of €10 million during the lifetime of the lease. The OPW has been in ongoing negotiations with the landlord, Beef Baron Larry Goodman's Remley Developments, since 2018 to try and recalibrate the lease and save money. Press has stalled because of the pandemic and Goodman's side wanting to hold a face-to-face meeting instead of the virtual meeting being insisted upon by the OPW. And staying with the theme of numbers and figures, on Friday, the CSO published deaths registered in 2020, showing that they are, as expected, broadly in line with the previous 5 years. There was 31,765 deaths registered in 2020, which is an increase in previous years. However, when the population increase in 2020 is factored in, it shows that there were 646 deaths registered per 100,000 of the population. This compares to 650 deaths registered per 100,000 in 2019 and an average 641 deaths registered between 2015 and 2019. In summary, the number of deaths registered in 2020 fell below the 5-year average. Now, night after night, people sat glued to the television listening to announcements on the numbers of people dying from COVID. And this was used by the government to justify lockdown. And they were aided and abetted by the mainstream media. And I suppose it's no surprise that there was a media blackout on the latest information coming from the CSO. The only reference was in Saturday's Irish Mail. And if you look there, you can see the last 4 sentences there that are highlighted. As you can see, the deaths registered in 2020 fall under a headline: we're having fewer babies and leaving it later to get pregnant. On Sunday evening then, Leo Varadkar tweeted that Ireland was the second lowest in the EU for excess mortality. And he accompanied this tweet with the graph that you're now looking at. Now, what Leo Varadkar did not point out is that Sweden, with no lockdown, fared almost as good as Ireland, that was in lockdown to one extent or another from March 2020. Now, TDs were warned this week that the health system is not prepared for the epidemic of cancer cases coming down the track. Avril Power, Chief Executive of the Irish Cancer Society, told the Oireachtas Health Committee that up to 2,000 invasive cancers may have been missed last year due to the impact of COVID-19. She said that there has been, and I quote, hammer blow after hammer blow to cancer services in the last 15 months, first from COVID and then the impact of the HSE cyber attack. And she said that the health system is under intolerable strain, with healthcare professionals burned out and cancer patients at breaking point. However, it was people coming out to enjoy the sunshine after a month of heavy rain and a year in lockdown that infuriated Tony Holohan, who tweeted on Saturday night, and I quote, "Drove into Dublin city centre to collect someone from work at 8:15 p.m. Absolutely shocked at scenes in South Great George's Street, Exchequer Street, South William Street area. Enormous crowds, like a major open-air party. As expected, the Sunday papers all rode in behind Mr. Holohan, and the talk shows on radio and TV throughout Sunday featuring politicians and commentators were all broadly in agreement with him. Then the tide turned. The more than 3,500 replies to his tweet challenged him. Well-known media personality Amanda Brunker was among those who commented, and she wrote, and I quote, "You lost the crowd a long time ago. This nanny state is out of control. You can't treat adults like naughty toddlers." In yesterday's Irish Times, Roisin Ingle told Holohan, "Finger wag away, but save your absolute shock for what matters." She wrote, "Finger wag away, but make it count. Finger wag about homelessness, about funding for mental health services, the property crisis. Wag your fingers about the complete absence of any planning and imagination and facilities and provisions for the outdoor summer authorities had a whole year to plan for. Sometimes there are no words, really no words." And we'll take a look now at a video clip of Dermot and Dave, who had a discussion on 2FM about Dr. Holohan's.
Crowds were gathering across the country in the city, and they're being widely condemned from on high. In fact, Tony Holohan, Dr. Tony Holohan, hit out at scenes of enormous crowds gathered in the capital on Saturday night. And when I heard that, I have to say, my blood started to boil. And I was like so sick of the finger wagging from the authorities, in air quotes, because, for God's sake, you've been talking about outdoor summer for the last how many weeks? You've closed all the pubs. You can't go anywhere. They're not having house parties.
Okay.
Of course they're going to be on the street. When I heard Tony Holohan talking about this, you know what? It brought to mind one of those Dickensian movies. You know, where the Lord of the Manor is in bed and one of his footmen comes in and goes, "I'm afraid the peasants are revolting in the streets."
Right.
"Shall we have them shot, sire?" No, I want to see for myself." "No, you're too weak." "No, I must leave the bed. Have my carriage made ready." And then they get into the carriage, and it drives into the slums. And he's peeking through the velvet curtain of his gilded carriage. And you know the way they hold up the white lacy handkerchief to cover their nose and their mouth, to cover the foul stench of the ruffians in the streets.
The open sewage.
Yeah. And he's driving around St. William Street in Dublin, and he sees people having pints and doing what they were pretty much told to do. And then he goes, "No, I've seen enough. Take me back." And he goes back in his carriage, and "I shall have to take to the bed for a week. No disturbances."
Did you see?
The response from local authorities and the OPW has been to fence off parks and beaches ahead of the bank holiday weekend. Common sense is another victim of the last 15 months, Aontú leader Peadar Tóibín said yesterday, as he pointed out the obvious. Not 1.1% of all COVID transmissions happened outdoors. Shutting down public spaces is resulting in more people in tighter spaces, raising the risk of transmission. And we'll take a look now at a video of a Deputy Peadar Tóibín, who is the Aontú leader, speaking in the Dáil about what is actually happening.
And they're going a step further on this occasion. There's photographs up on social media now of the bandstand in St. Stephen's Green being fenced off. And I'm hearing in other parts of the country they're fencing off the public realm from young people. Now, 0.1% of the transmissions of this illness happened outside. And yet now the government is actively fencing off the outside from people. The problem is with these restrictions, they don't delete human activity. They simply displace human activity. And if you reduce the spaces that human activity can exist, well, then people are going to be corralled in bigger numbers. And that whole action is self-defeating in the long run. You know, there's reports there by the Taoiseach saying that the July reopening might be reviewed. He says if people don't follow the rules, he's going to catch them. Unbelievable response from the Taoiseach of the country, saying that if they're not good children, he will punish them by further restrictions in the future. One of the issues that's really frustrated me over the last while is that there is a really virulent variant at the moment. I call it the Donal variant. And that variant is a serious and a deadly threat to common sense. And all of the things that we've seen in the last while shows that common sense has been heavily attacked by this particular variant. And the sad thing is that the opposition is not immune to this variant. In actual fact, most of the opposition wanted to go further than the government over the last month, even up to a number of weeks ago. And even Sinn Féin were sitting on the fence. They abstained in the Seanad, and they flip-flopped now to a no vote here today. An opposition needs to hold the government to account. The government won't be able to do its job properly unless it's pushed to the limit by an opposition. And that opposition hasn't done its job here in this state over the last while. So where are we now? We're in a situation today where there's 93 people with COVID in hospitals. So all of the people with COVID in hospitals could fit in Navan Hospital at the moment, and there'd still be 20 beds left over in that one hospital. Thankfully, that number is extremely low. Now, it amazes me how insular this country still is. We're so inward-looking.
The amazing thing is that they are literally making it up as they're going along. The Taoiseach Leo Varadkar was asked last Friday on Morning Ireland to explain the science around why hotels could serve customers food from June 2nd, but restaurants and pubs can't do it indoors until July the 5th. And he said that the reason was, and I quote, more of a practical one than a scientific one. Writing in the Mail on Sunday, its political editor, John Lee, wrote that this was, and I quote, a simple admission of the specific to cover the general. There has been no scientific or medical justification for the many restrictions on personal freedoms we've endured since March 2020. John Lee went on to write, a strange, sinister tendency to shout down anyone who asks hard questions about the state's marshalling of COVID has also emerged. Dr. Tony Holohan, a pleasant man who has this year suffered personal anguish, has been given an elevated public status. But he is not answerable to the electorate. He is a bureaucrat who chairs a team of wearied, overburdened medics and civil servants who advise the government on scientific matters. I asked the minister during the week whether he agreed with colleagues' pleas to disband NPHET. He replied, NPHET is the best cover a government ever had. The true political cynicism in elevating NPHET was exposed in this stark sentence. There is a fatwa upon you if you question the validity of COVID-19 restrictions. We take a look now at a video of how the government rammed through legislation last night that will give Stephen Donnelly the power to make laws without consulting the Dáil.
The next question is the proposal for dealing with Wednesday's business agreed to.
Not agreed.
Deputy Michael McNamara.
Count Corley, there's a proposal in it with regard to a bill which will provide that restrictions and lockdowns can continue indefinitely. And that bill is being guillotined. Now, if the government believes this is the right thing to do, then debate the proposals with the opposition. You have the numbers. If you morally and intellectually believe this is necessary in the interests of the Irish state and Irish society,
all right,
debate it.
Thank you. Deputy Matthew McGrath.
Oh my God, I too object strenuously to this. We had no pre-legislative scrutiny in this legislation. 4 pieces of legislation are now involved, and it was meant to be a cancellation of the sunset clause in June. Here we are with this legislation now being guillotined. 2.5 hours debate tomorrow, all stages. It is a total insult to democratically elected people here, and it's totally unacceptable, and I am fully opposed to it.
Deputy Peadar Tobin.
Yeah, I'd like to just add my voice in relation to that. Never in the history of the state have I ever seen a bill which has bypassed the democratic processes of this country by so much. 40,000 people received fines just in the last year for going about normal activities. We've seen Taoiseach pass the Dáil and go to RTE studios to make announcements where TDs can't get a chance to challenge him on this. The idea that a bill of such import will be guillotined in such a manner is absolutely wrong.
Thank you, Deputy. By and large.
All opposition parties and independents voted against the measure in the Dáil last night to extend powers to Stephen Donnelly. He will now be able to bring in laws without consulting with the Dáil, and that includes extending the powers of the Gardaí. The vote was passed by 73 votes to 68 with no abstentions, and it was passed in the Shannon last week. The bill now has to go to the President to be signed into law. One of the functions of the President is to block legislation passed in the Dáil that's deemed unconstitutional. Rather than signing it into law to give Stephen Donnelly these powers never given before to any minister in a time of peace, the President can invoke Article 26 of the Constitution and call in a Council of State meeting. Now, he did call a Council of State meeting in 2015 in relation to legislation passed relating to direct provision and asylum seekers. The President has spent a lifetime speaking out against foreign dictators. So we'll know now after Saturday or Sunday morning if he is going to defend democracy in Ireland. A tyranny of the majority made up of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Green Party now rule the country, and they have no regard for the democratic process. Aoife Moore, the political correspondent with the Irish Examiner, reported last night that the Dáil Business Committee has been asked to waive a pre-legislative scrutiny on the local property tax bill. The legislation will result in people living in the 100,000 homes built since 2013 being brought into the property tax net. It also means that people living in high-end properties will have a reduction in their property tax. A house valued at 2.35 million in 2013 with a current estimated value of 2.61 million will see a reduction in their property tax from 5,825 to the new rate of 5,760 euro. And I'm just wondering if this reduction in property tax for high-end homeowners has anything to do with the upcoming by-election in the very affluent and wealthy Dublin Bay South constituency. We'll just take a look now at some of the candidates. You're looking there at James Geoghegan. He's a barrister and the son of 2 Supreme Court judges. He's actually living in a house that's not actually in the constituency. And landlady Deirdre Conroy, running on the Fianna Fáil ticket, found herself this week having to defend a blog she wrote about when she wrote about one of her tenants from Latvia. Now, I have always maintained that, you know, I come from a place where I am a mother of adult children, and my concern has always been the future that we are creating for our children and for our grandchildren. And I make no apologies now for showing you this video. It's a promotional video that has been made by Bridget Purcell, who is running also in the Dublin Bay South by-election. And we'll have a look now. Okay, we just seem to be having a little technical difficulty at the minute playing this promotional video. As I say, Bridget is running for People Before Profit. She's 25 years old, and she has worked as in retail, and she has worked also in hospitality. So she has made this wonderful promotional video outlining how she has found herself entering the whole world of politics. It's okay. So that's okay. You can, unfortunately, we don't have that promotional video, but perhaps we'll be able to put a link to it in the comment box underneath, and it is really worth watching. Bridget definitely gives a young person's perspective, and she speaks for young people that are working in low-paid temporary employment, facing huge high rents, and just living with great insecurity. So I really do wish Bridget the very best in the upcoming election, because I'm so delighted to see a young person actually running. And so I want to thank you so much for watching. And as always, I ask you please to share this video. And as I always do, I'm going to leave you with a question to ponder over the next couple of days. What are the chances of the President, Michael D. Higgins, convening a Council of State meeting rather than signing into law the bill that was passed last night in the Dáil that gives the Minister for Health, Stephen Donnelly, powers that have never been given to a minister before in peacetime since the foundation of the state 100 years ago?
That's a good question, Anna. I think the answer is pretty obvious. There's as much chance of that happening as Michael D. Higgins, the president, becoming a leading world basketball player. It's highly unlikely at this stage. That's a busy show. We ran over time, but I think it was well worth it as usual. We're back here next Thursday night at 9 p.m. on the Irish Inquiry. I'd like to thank our guests, Brendan Kelly, Donal Jackson and Kevin Howard, for what was a really informative and interesting set of discussions tonight. Join us next week, as I say. In the meantime, share the show, get it liked and shared out there as much as possible. It's one of the only balanced alternative media outlets in the country, and we need to build it up. We ain't got no cash, folks, so we need you to use your social capital to get this show out there. See you next week. Thanks for tuning in.